A bank fraud investigator called me on a Tuesday afternoon, asking to confirm whether I'd recently applied for a $40,000 business loan under my own name. I hadn't. I hadn't applied for anything. But someone had, someone who knew my social security number, my mother's maiden name, my childhood address, every single security question a bank could possibly ask. Someone who had in fact been using my identity for the better part of 3 years, quietly building a credit history and a business loan application in my name, without me ever noticing a single red flag. That someone was my twin sister. If you've ever discovered that the person closest to you in the entire world had been living a secret financial life using your own name, stay with me, because what the bank uncovered didn't just expose a fraud. It exposed exactly how far my sister had been willing to go, and exactly how long she thought she could keep going before anyone noticed. My name is Naomi, and my twin sister Nadia and I have spent our entire lives being compared, confused, and quietly measured against each other in ways that most siblings never have to experience. Nadia and I are identical twins, though anyone who knew us well could tell us apart easily enough. Different mannerisms, different laughs, the small distinguishing details that develop between even the most similar-looking siblings over 3 decades of separate lives. But strangers confused us constantly, growing up. And I think that specific, lifelong experience of being mistaken for each other shaped something in how Nadia eventually decided to use that resemblance, years later, in a way I never could have anticipated. Our lives had diverged considerably by our late 20s. I'd built a stable career as a physical therapist, married, bought a modest house, and maintained the kind of careful, disciplined financial habits that had earned me a genuinely excellent credit score over the better part of a decade. Nadia's path had been considerably rockier, a series of business ventures that never quite worked out, mounting debt from decisions that hadn't panned out the way she'd hoped, and a credit history that, by her early 30s, had become significant enough of a liability that traditional lenders were no longer willing to extend her the kind of credit she needed for her latest venture. I didn't know the full extent of Nadia's financial struggles at the time all of this started. She'd always been private about money, in a way I'd chalked up to simple pride, the specific discomfort some people feel discussing financial difficulty with even their closest family. I had no idea, during the years this story actually unfolded, that her privacy about money had a considerably darker explanation than simple embarrassment. I later learned, through the investigation that followed, that Nadia's use of my identity had begun almost 3 years before that fraud investigator's phone call, during a period when her latest business venture, a boutique event planning company that had struggled from its earliest months, desperately needed capital that her own damaged credit history made impossible to secure through legitimate means. Nadia, it turned out, had used our childhood shared history, details about our family that she knew as intimately as I did, since they were, quite literally, her own history too, combined with personal information she'd had access to over the years, including my social security number from a period when we'd shared a joint bank account briefly in our early 20s, to begin building a secondary credit profile in my name. She started small, according to what investigators eventually pieced together. A single credit card, opened in my name, using our shared childhood address history and personal details only a sibling would know, used carefully, and paid on time for over a year, specifically to build a clean credit history under my identity that she could eventually leverage for something larger. I want to be honest about how completely I missed every warning sign during this period, because I think it matters to understanding how something like this can persist for years without detection. I didn't check my credit report regularly, a habit I've since corrected, painfully. I didn't receive statements for the account Nadia opened because she'd had them directed to a different address from the very beginning. My actual financial life continued completely undisturbed, my real accounts and real credit history entirely separate from the parallel identity Nadia was quietly constructing using my name. Over the following 2 years, according to what the investigation eventually revealed, Nadia expanded this fraudulent credit history considerably, opening 2 additional credit cards in my name, all managed carefully enough to avoid triggering any obvious red flags, all paid consistently enough to build exactly the kind of clean, trustworthy credit profile a bank would eventually view favorably for a substantial loan application. The final piece of this scheme, and the one that ultimately led to its discovery, was a $40,000 business loan application Nadia submitted, using my identity in full, to a regional bank, an application built on nearly 3 years of carefully constructed credit history, all of it operating under my name, all of it completely invisible to me throughout the entire process. What Nadia hadn't anticipated, and what ultimately unraveled the entire scheme, was a routine identity verification step the bank's fraud department implemented as part of their standard loan approval process for amounts over a certain threshold, a step that involved directly contacting the applicant's listed phone number to confirm details of the application, using contact information the bank had on file from an entirely unrelated source. My actual physical therapy practice's business registration, which listed my legitimate contact information as part of standard licensing requirements. The bank's fraud investigator called that number, my real number, expecting to reach the person who'd submitted the loan application. Instead, she reached me, genuinely confused, having never submitted any such application in my life. I want to describe that initial phone call carefully, because the disorientation of it has stayed with me long after the rest of this situation resolved. "I'm calling to verify some details on your business loan application," the investigator said, her tone entirely routine, clearly expecting a straightforward confirmation call. "I haven't applied for any business loan," I told her, genuinely confused rather than alarmed at first, assuming some kind of simple administrative error. The investigator's tone shifted immediately into something more careful, more measured. "Can you confirm your date of birth and the last 4 digits of your social security number for me?" I confirmed both, and there was a pause on the other end of the line that I still remember vividly. The specific pause of someone realizing they've stumbled into something considerably more complicated than a routine verification call. "Mrs. Alvarez," she said, "I need to be very direct with you. Someone has submitted a $40,000 business loan application using your identity, supported by nearly 3 years of credit history built under your name. I need you to understand this may be a serious identity theft situation, and we'll need to work through this carefully together." The days following that phone call involved an intensive, disorienting process of working with the bank's fraud department, filing police reports, and beginning the specific, exhausting work of untangling 3 years of fraudulent activity conducted under my name. I want to be honest that my mind, during those early days, genuinely didn't connect this fraud to Nadia at all. I assumed, as most people probably would, that this represented some kind of external, impersonal identity theft. A stranger who'd somehow acquired my personal information through a data breach or some other anonymous vector. The kind of story you hear about happening to other people. It was during the bank's more detailed investigation into the specific mailing addresses associated with the fraudulent accounts that the truth began to surface. One of the addresses, cross-referenced against public records, matched a P.O. box that investigators eventually traced back, through a chain of financial documentation, to Nadia's own name. The fraud investigator called me again, several days into the investigation, her voice carrying a specific, careful gravity that immediately told me something significant had changed. "Mrs. Alvarez," she said, "I need to ask you something difficult. Do you have a sister named Nadia?" I felt my entire body go cold in a way I still find difficult to fully describe. "She's my twin sister," I said. "Why are you asking me that?" I confronted Nadia directly, that same evening, before the investigation had fully concluded, needing to hear the truth from her before I could process any further official confirmation. I want to describe what that conversation felt like, because it remains one of the most disorienting experiences of my entire life. Sitting across from someone who looked exactly like me, sharing our exact same face, our exact same voice, while I asked her whether she'd spent 3 years secretly building a fraudulent financial identity using my own name. Nadia didn't deny it immediately, which I think, in its own strange way, made the conversation considerably worse than an immediate denial would have. She sat quietly for a long moment before finally speaking. "I was going to pay it all back," she said, her voice small in a way I genuinely never heard from her before. "Every single dollar. I just needed the capital to finally make the event planning business work, and my own credit was completely destroyed. I knew your credit was good. I knew I could build something clean under your name if I was careful enough. I never meant for you to actually be hurt by any of it. You used my social security number, I said, my voice shaking with an anger I hadn't fully accessed until that exact moment. For 3 years, Nadia, 3 years of my identity, tied to debts I never agreed to, decisions I never made, all because you decided your need was more important than what it would cost me if this ever came apart. Over the following weeks, as the investigation concluded and the full scope of Nadia's fraud became clear, I learned details that made the entire situation considerably more painful than even that initial confrontation had revealed. Nadia had, in fact, made consistent, careful payments on the fraudulent credit cards for nearly the entire 3-year period, specifically to maintain the appearance of a clean, trustworthy credit history under my name, meaning that, in a strange, uncomfortable way, my actual credit score had been artificially inflated by her careful management of debt I never knew existed, a detail that complicated my feelings about the situation in ways I hadn't initially anticipated. But the final $40,000 loan application represented a different kind of risk entirely, a debt considerably beyond what Nadia's event planning business could realistically service, based on its actual financial performance. Meaning that had this loan actually been approved and disbursed, I would have been legally responsible for a debt I never agreed to, tied to a business I had no stake in, no control over, and no visibility into whatsoever. The bank's fraud department, once the situation was fully confirmed, voided the loan application and worked with me to formally dispute and remove the fraudulent accounts from my credit history, a process that took several additional months to fully resolve, even after Nadia's involvement was confirmed. I want to be honest about a decision I had to make that I know some people watching this will judge harshly in either direction. I ultimately chose not to pursue full criminal fraud charges against Nadia, despite the bank's fraud department confirming that I had every legal right to do so. This wasn't a decision I made lightly, and I want to be clear that it doesn't reflect any minimization of what Nadia actually did. It reflected, instead, a complicated, painful calculation about our relationship as twin sisters, about the specific weight of family history we shared, and about my own uncertainty regarding what pursuing criminal charges against my own sister would actually accomplish, beyond a kind of retribution that felt, to me, considerably more complicated than satisfying. I did, however, insist on several conditions as part of resolving this situation privately rather than criminally. Nadia agreed to a legally binding repayment plan for the actual fraudulent debts accumulated under my name, structured through a formal agreement drafted by an attorney, with specific consequences if she failed to comply. I also insisted, as a condition of not pursuing criminal charges, that Nadia begin working with a financial counselor to address the underlying financial instability that had driven her toward this decision in the first place. I won't pretend that Nadia and I have returned to anything resembling the closeness we shared before this entire situation unfolded. I don't think that would be honest, and I think stories that promise a full, uncomplicated reconciliation after something this significant do a disservice to how real relationships actually work after a betrayal of this scale. We speak now, occasionally, primarily around the logistics of her repayment plan and around unavoidable family gatherings that neither of us wants to make more uncomfortable for our parents than necessary. But the specific, easy intimacy of twin sisters who'd shared every major life experience together has been replaced by something considerably more guarded, more careful, more aware of exactly how far Nadia proved herself willing to go when she believed her need justified it. I've had to make peace with understanding that Nadia's decision wasn't really about me specifically. It was about a desperate, escalating financial situation that she'd apparently convinced herself justified using the one resource she had unique access to, an identity so similar to her own that she believed, for 3 years, she could manage it carefully enough that I'd never actually be harmed by it. I think about this entire experience often, and about the specific, unsettling realization that the person who committed this fraud against me wasn't a stranger exploiting a data breach, but my own twin sister, someone who'd shared my entire childhood, my exact face, and apparently, a willingness to use both of those things against me when she believed her circumstances demanded it. I don't think there's a clean, simple lesson in a betrayal this specific and this personal, but I have learned, in the time since, to actively monitor my own credit and financial accounts in ways I never bothered to before. Not out of general paranoia, but out of a hard-earned understanding that even the people closest to you, the people who share your literal face, are not automatically incapable of causing you this kind of harm. I've also learned something more complicated about forgiveness, or at least about the specific, incomplete version of it I've been able to extend to Nadia. I don't think what she did is forgivable in any complete sense, but I've chosen not to let it destroy every remaining connection between us, largely because I understand, even now, that the desperation driving her decision was real, even if the choice she made in response to that desperation was genuinely, seriously wrong. If this story stunned you the way it stunned me living through it, I want you to remember something. Even the people closest to you, the people who share your history, your face, your entire childhood, are capable of choices that can genuinely hurt you when desperation convinces them the cost is justified. Protecting yourself, even from the people you love most, isn't cynicism. It's simply wisdom, earned the hard way. If this story hit home, hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments, have you ever discovered that someone extremely close to you was capable of something you never could have imagined? I read every single comment, and I've got more stories like this one coming every week.